Good afternoon, and welcome to the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia's presentation of A Conversation with Ambassador Robert Lighthizer. My name is John Emery, and I serve as Managing Director for JP Morgan's corporate client banking business in Philadelphia. I also serve as a member of the Council's Board of Directors. We're looking forward to a robust conversation on U.S. trade policy, one of the most hotly debated topics of the last 4 years, and one subject to heightened attention in light of the global pandemic. JP Morgan Chase & Company has long been a significant partner of the Council. We are delighted to be involved in the Council's mission of bringing education and civil discourse to Philadelphians of all ages. We truly believe in the guiding principle of the Council that democracy demands discourse. Today's conversation on U.S. trade policy with Ambassador Lighthizer is a continuation of our long-term partnership with the Council to bring to this forum important conversations with speakers from all manners of ideological backgrounds. In the past few years, we have sponsored events with Secretary John Kerry on Iran policy and with our Chairman and CEO, Jamie Dimon, on global finance. As a part of this mission, we are happy to partner with other Philadelphia institutions in our support of the Council and its programs. I'd like to thank our education partner, Temple University's Center for International Business Education and Research, based at the Fox School of Business. Since 2002, Temple Cyber has hosted and supported international trade-related events for students in the business community. This cyber program consists of 15 universities nationwide that receive federal funding from the U.S. Department of Education with a focus on U.S. economic competitiveness in international markets. I'd also like to thank Ed and Sima Satel for their kind support of a new series of annual events at the Council titled the Satel Family Programs, of which tonight's event is the first. Finally, I'd like to thank the Council's CEO, Craig Snyder, for his dedication and leadership over the years. His role in leading public discussion in our community around important issues has been highly valued. Now I'd like to turn it over to my good friend, Ed Satel, to introduce our guest. Ed?
Thank you, John. John is a well-known young executive who helped establish the JP Morgan both in the Philadelphia region and as a great corporate member of the World Affairs Council. John is also a terrific member of the Satel Institute. So good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to the first event in the Satel Family Speaker Series. For a little background, I've been involved with the World Affairs Council as a supporter of programs and a board member for almost 25 years. I've always agreed with the Council's mantra: in a democracy, agreement is not essential, participation is. Democracy demands discourse, and the World Affairs Council is unique in providing real access to so many, access to thought leaders and policymakers who help shape our world. That knowledge is vital for an informed citizenry and has never been more important or impactful than now. Tonight, we will hear an insider's perspective from one of those leaders. Robert Lighthizer was sworn in as the 18th United States Trade Representative in May of 2017. As an experienced trade negotiator and a litigator, Ambassador Lighthizer brings a history of tough U.S. trade enforcement and a record of standing up for American workers, farmers, and manufacturers, and businesses in the United States of America. Ambassador Lighthizer recently led successful negotiations, very successful negotiations, on the United States-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement, the United States-China Phase 1 Agreement, and the U.S.-Japan Trade Agreement. We are excited to have Ambassador Lighthizer here this evening talk about his perspective on U.S. trade and the new challenges presented during and after this time, followed by a Q&A period which you can all participate in. I will now turn it over to my good friend, Craig Snyder, President and CEO for the World Affairs Council, to begin our discussion. Craig?
Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I'm Craig Snyder, the Council's President. I want to thank all of our partners who you've seen for supporting us this evening. Ed Satel, JP Morgan Chase, and the Temple University Cyber Program. Just a reminder to everyone that this session of the council is off the record. We are closed for the press today. As the ambassador's schedule gives us only about a half hour, if you would like to pose a question, I would ask you to type it now or as soon as possible into the questions bar. And with that, Mr. Ambassador, welcome to you. Thank you for your time today. And may we have whatever opening remarks you'd like to make.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Craig. And it's an honor to be here with you all this evening. I thought what I would do is talk a little bit about the trade policy and then maybe give a little bit of the history of it. And I can give more in answer to questions. I would say, first of all, President Trump, we all know, ran on a variety of things, but one of them was the fact that we have developed over a period of time a trade policy which was not helping American workers, farmers, and ranchers and businesses. The evidence of that is fairly clear. We've lost over a period of time some 5 million manufacturing jobs. We've seen 60,000 factories close, and we haven't seen the growth that you would expect in our economy. So we had a trade policy which in his opinion, in my opinion, and the opinion I think of the voters, was one that was failing the American worker. What we had really was a policy that was based on trying to follow efficiency instead of worrying about what was good for the workers. So the notion was any trade agreement was a good agreement. If you have more trade, that's better. And then at the end of the day, you would figure out a way to deal with the dislocations. That is to say, the workers and farmers who suffered. The President Trump turned that around and thought about it exactly the opposite way. His view was, let's find a policy that creates the kind of communities we want, and then move backward to that to make sure that we have the people and the jobs and stable families and the like that is the object of the trade policy, and then we'll create a trade policy that results in that rather than merely focusing on efficiency and free trade. So just real quickly, how we got to where we are, I'll just give you just the thumbnails the way we see it, the thumbnails sketch. If you go back in American history, we had reasonably high tariffs over a period of time. We built up a manufacturing base. There was a debate back and forth in the country about whether we should have tariffs which were just to help industry or just to raise money. We called them protection tariffs. But the whole scale of tariffs during the whole period, even those who were against protection tariffs were still in favor of fairly high tariffs. And that went on for a long period of time, back and forth. We can talk about various ebbs and flows. We got to World War II and everything changed. The United States really made a decision, I think it was the right decision, that we had to reduce trade barriers and get more and more trade to help Europe and other parts of the world rebuild. And we did that. We followed that policy, and I think it was successful. We were opposing the Soviet Union, we'll all recall, and it was the free world versus them, and the policy went on. We had 8 rounds to reduce tariffs and other barriers. And then by 1995, we entered what is now the WTO. It had been called the GATT, as you know, Craig, but the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and then it became officially WTO in 1995. And from then, we saw the situation change and get more dramatic, and the numbers that we've seen all went south. So I guess what we are saying is we're getting bad results, and we're doing it based on a policy really that is seriously outmoded. It's 70 years. It made sense at the beginning. It probably makes less sense now. And now we ought to have a more worker, farmer, rancher oriented trade policy rather than one that has other geopolitical ideas. I would just add one more footnote, and that is USTR was created in the Kennedy administration in 1962. And it was created largely because President Kennedy had the view that too often the State Department, who was doing trade policy, would sacrifice our economic well-being for foreign policy goals. So he started this office. The first USTR was Christian Herter, who had been Eisenhower Secretary of State. He started the office, and its objective really was to push back against this notion that we're going to sell out our workers for foreign policy goals. But we haven't really changed the policy, and I think we've seen a different direction now. You've seen us redo the USMCA, put tariffs on China as a result of a lengthy process, and negotiate better deals with Japan and Korea and the like. And the objective is jobs and workers and trying to get wages up for Americans. So as well as efficiency too, right? It isn't like it's all one or the other. So maybe that's enough on that. I can take you through more history if people are interested, but they may have more precise questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. You've spoken and you've written in a sort of a nuanced middle ground term between protectionism, or what people have called protectionism on the one hand, and a kind of unfettered globalism on the other hand, which you've described as being sort of the American post-war policy. But the current, we are obviously in a campaign at the moment. I know you're not involved in the campaign, but the president's campaign rhetoric around America First, particularly things like the onshoring of manufacturing from pharmaceuticals to automobiles, sure sounds like what people used to call protectionism. And the rhetoric of some of the president's more prominent supporters, perhaps even more so. Just the other night, I saw the Fox News ratings champion Tucker Carlson say that America's globalists think that, quote, cheap plastic stuff from China, end quote, is more important than well-paying middle-class jobs. So my question here is, how, in the context of a heated presidential campaign, is it possible for the American people to understand a nuanced position between protectionism and globalism, or are they being asked to choose one or the other?
So, I mean, that's a big question. I would say, first of all, there is a stark contrast. Once again, I don't want to be political, but there is a stark contrast. Vice President Biden voted to give most favored nation treatment to China. He voted for USMCA. He's very much down the road that has changed. I would say the other thing I would say is that is not a particularly popular view amongst in his party. When we changed USMCA, we got 90% of the Congress to vote for us. We got an overwhelming majority of Democrats in the House and the Senate to vote for our changes. So I think that the policies, some of these globalization policies, are now more and more accepted as being policies that really have failed American workers. Now, in terms of a nuance, your point is right. In every campaign, nuance tends to disappear. You've noticed that the Democrats really don't talk about trade. I think they find it the global view, that's the globalist view, that's the view of the vice president, is not a popular view. The president will talk about trade because it's one of the things he feels strongest about. If you notice, in their convention, the word was almost not mentioned, and in our convention, it was talked about a lot. So I think that is some evidence that the trend is going in our way. I take your point. You're not going to get a lot of nuance in a campaign. It's not something that happens. But it certainly is what we've had, I think, in the way we've governed. The president really hasn't, our policy really hasn't been straight protectionism, large tariffs, keep exports out. In the case of China, it was very much focused on technology theft and failure to protect intellectual property and certain barriers that they had that were unfair. In the case of USMCA, it wasn't just shutting off trade with Mexico and Canada. It was rewriting the rules so they're fairer for American workers and farmers. So I would say we have governed very much in a nuanced middle ground way. Now, if you're a pure globalist, it might look like protectionism. But protectionism looks very different than what we have done. What it would be traditionally called protectionism is very different than what we have done.
You've mentioned USMCA a couple of times. Can you tell our audience what you think the key differences are between NAFTA and USMCA? Some folks, of course, have said the changes are cosmetic. It's just NAFTA 2.0. Obviously, Bill, it's a substantive difference.
So yeah, no, it's a remarkably different agreement. People who say, well, it's basically the same thing, or people who haven't read it, don't know how many chapters are in it, don't really have a clue about what's going on in the agreement. They're just repeating talking points. And I might say it's odd, the Democrats, when they supported it, said it was very significantly improved, right? The speaker said it was a great agreement, and others. So the people who are sort of taking that position are people who are, for the most part, free traders and don't want to acknowledge the fact that it needed improvement. So when you say what are the most important changes, I would say, first of all, the single biggest change is and there's a bunch of them, it's a totally different agreement. But if you look at what had happened to our auto industry and all the parts of manufacturing that come out of auto industry, we were losing our auto industry in the United States. If you look at before this agreement was passed, the previous 11 auto plants built in North America, eight of them were built in Mexico for shipment to the United States. And that was function of the rules of origin and the way they were created. So we totally rewrote the rules of origin to get more U.S. production. So there's a requirement for a high labor value, and it's more U.S. production, and a lot of other very complicated areas. We required them to put more steel, which basically comes from the United States, in a variety of these products. So, and then if you move to the next step, if you look to intellectual, other sections of the agreement that are massive changes, you look at intellectual property protection. It's the most robust we've ever had. Labor protection, it's by far the most robust. It's not only robust, it requires a very high standard of treatment of labor, but it's also enforceable. It's the furthest agreement in the environmental area that the United States has ever agreed to. If you look at digital trade, it's the absolute gold standard in the way the digital trade is way beyond what we have now. Financial services, it's way beyond what we have now. So if you really go down the line in the economy, if you're interested in agriculture, it's got requirements for science-based biotech and barriers. So it eliminates barriers. It takes what we really consider to be the gold standard. And in a lot of areas like digital trade, we are really spreading that around the world. Other people are starting to realize this is the best agreement. So it's massively different. And if you look at how the ITC scored it, the International Trade Commission, which is independent, they scored it as the biggest improvement in its history of any agreement it's ever shown. So, yeah, we're very proud of it. We worked, as I say, it's not a partisan thing. There are lots of Democrats who worked hard on it with me, and a lot of Republicans, and we got a really terrific result, which is going to create somewhere between 100 and 500,000. I mean, a large number of new jobs when fully implemented.
Let's look forward for a moment. If the president is reelected, what is the top of the trade agenda? Is it a second and larger deal with China? And if so, what do you want to see there? That being obviously the most important trade relationship. And secondly, would you be focused on a separate trade deal with post-Brexit Britain?
So I would say, first of all, we have to really focus in any trade agreements on enforcement. One of the problems we've had is that the United States, for decades, Republicans and Democrats have negotiated agreements, some good, some not so good, but they haven't really enforced them. And so we really have to focus on enforcement. I also think there has to be some focus on the fact that there are these wild differences within the WTO in tariffs. So there are products that the United States has no tariffs on, and other countries and particularly in Asia, but also South America and other places, have 30–40% tariffs on. There's this wide variety and it's really a product of these negotiating rounds in each one. The United States and to some extent Europe have made more concessions than they've gotten. So we end up with wildly different tariffs that are hurting American businesses and American workers, right? So I think that's something else that we have to focus on. Enforcement, first of all. Obviously the tariffs and the problems at the WTO have to be addressed. In terms of new negotiations, we have to keep focusing on China. For sure, that's true. That's the biggest economic relationship. We have to get that so that it's reciprocal and more balanced. And then you mentioned the UK. Yes, we are engaged in negotiations with the UK. Hopefully those will be completed in the next several months. We both want to have a good trade relationship. We already have a lot of trade, as you can imagine, and investment between the United States and Great Britain. And we certainly expect to have a deal there. We're also talking, as you're probably aware, and some people in Philadelphia are interested, with Kenya. Our sense is that in the next 20 years, you're going to have 2.4 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa, and we don't really have a sensible trade relationship down there now. We have a one-way kind of giveaway program, which needs to be changed really into something more reciprocal and higher standards. So we have negotiation with Kenya as a kind of a start of a model to try to hopefully spread the free enterprise system, our system, in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's a lot of things that we have to do, a lot of things going on. If you said what's going to end up spent on the next time for the next couple of years, I'm sure the single biggest thing will probably continue to be China. But there are a lot of other pieces that I've suggested.
We have a couple of questions from the audience that relate to TPP. So the first question is there anything from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that should be brought back? And the second question is, can the United States have a viable trade relationship with Central Asia and other East Asian states in the absence of TPP, or do the Chinese just sort of own the territory?
So this is a great question, and let me talk about it for a second. First of all, are there things in the TPP that are useful? Yes, we went in when we renegotiated NAFTA and our agreement with Japan, and we looked at what was good there, and there was good work there. We plussed it up because we had the benefit of what had been done. We plussed it up, but there was some good stuff that was in there. Overall, was it a good agreement? No, it was a disastrous agreement, and it would have been very bad for the United States to enter into it. For example, I'll go back to this question of rules of origin on automobiles. It would have been possible, literally, to have a car be made 45% in Vietnam and 55% in China, even though China was not in the TPP, and be sold in the United States duty-free. I mean, it's just a crazy idea. It would have been horrible for the auto industry and those kinds of things. It didn't have financial services provisions that were nearly good enough. It didn't deal with currency. So it was a bad, flawed agreement, in my opinion. Now, let's take this geopolitical question. I get that from time to time, that it was really a geopolitical play. And I would say my first response to that is, what would have happened when China joined the TPP and then didn't follow the rules? We'd be in the same position we are in the WTO. So I don't buy the geopolitical argument. I guess the final thing I would say is, if you look at the 11 countries in TPP, all right, we have FTAs, free trade agreements, with 5 of them, all right, already. And of the others, by far the biggest is Japan, like 95% of the GDP that's not included, right? So we have an agreement with Japan which picks up the vast majority of what advantage the United States would have had from TPP. So our U.S.-Japan agreement picks up almost all the agricultural advantages and other advantages, the digital advantages from the TPP. So this notion that we're leaving something on the table, there are only 4 or 5 countries which we don't have an FTA or this Japan agreement, the biggest GDP of all of them is probably Vietnam, which has a lot of problems of its own, and that's less than $300 billion. So in terms of where we are, I would say we paid a lot less for it, and we have about the same situation had we been in it.
We have a question from one of our high school students who's watching. What career advice do you have for students who want to work in international trade?
Well, it seems to me the first question is what's international trade, right? So international business, there are a lot of big companies, and I think getting real business experience is the advice that I would give people. If you're interested in trade policy, which is what I do, there are a number of avenues, generally through the government or through academia. The group that I'm involved with, for the most part, to be honest, has a lot of lawyers. We have a lot of lawyers here because it's enforcement. It's very specific, and I think law school and law training can also be helpful. But there's places in the government for international trade policy and in academia and in business. Some of the people come from business and then do the policy side of it because they have practical real world experience. There's a lot of ways to get into this field. I'd certainly encourage you to do it. It's exciting. And because it combines really economics with foreign policy and with having real effect on people's lives. There's a lot of things you do, and you know this, Craig, from your years working on the Hill. There's a lot of things you do that just affect this company's bottom line or that company's bottom line. In international trade, the stuff you do, if it's done right, affects workers and their families and their communities, and that's a very rewarding thing. More so, I don't want to knock tax lawyers or anything, but more so than just tax policy would be. Right? I mean, you can see directly what effect it's having on steel workers, for example, or auto workers, or farmers, or the like. So it's a very rewarding field. There's a lot of ways to get into it. I certainly encourage people to do it.
Next question is, when negotiations with China began, did the administration anticipate that American farmers would need to be given taxpayer subsidies due to the loss of sales of agricultural products to the Chinese?
So I guess I'm not following the question. The question is, do we expect there to be basic? If you look at the phase 1 agreement, you'll see there's just in the area of agriculture, there are substantial agricultural goals or agreements. The agreement itself, and it's probably worth spending a minute on this, the agreement itself is not just about purchases, first of all. It's about structural change in the area of IP and tech transfer, financial services, currency, but also in agricultural barriers. So it has a very big structural piece. It has the tariffs, which stay in effect, which are, for the most part, which are very effective in terms of offsetting subsidies and the like and helping American business. And then it has purchasing agreements. Within the purchasing agreements that we have seen during the course of these just few months that it's been in effect, massive purchases of agricultural products by China. So I think it's been very successful in that respect. Now there are agricultural programs which have helped farmers. Farmers have had problems from time to time. I think, hopefully now most of that is behind them. But you have seen subsidies to farmers really over a long period of time. The president has used the program substantially, but it's a program that's been around a long time.
Next question, and I'm racing obviously as your deadline looms. How will you ensure, including by adjustment if necessary, that present and future tariff policies impacting raw materials will not adversely affect U.S. manufacturing competitiveness? How can we reasonably expect a resolution to the U.S.-Chinese trade conflict? Obviously, 2 questions, and the second being much larger.
So I'm sorry, what was the first one? Was tariff policy on raw materials?
Raw materials, yes. The impact on U.S. manufacturing capabilities.
Well, I mean, there's always that balance whenever you deal with not just raw materials, but inputs and parts and the like, and you have an obligation to both sides of your economy. So the United States is fortunate that it has a lot of raw materials, and in those areas, tariffs are of no concern, right? Because it's U.S. Raw materials that can be used in U.S. manufacturing, and that's an ideal situation. In terms of tariffs on other raw materials, they're really the U.S. industrial tariffs are actually fairly low. Tariffs on raw materials, there really are not a great deal of tariffs. For example, if you look at petroleum and things like that, there really are not very high tariffs. There are from time to time trade remedy actions, which we can talk about, where somebody in that business has an unfair trade situation that results in tariffs. But in terms of raw materials, but also imports of parts, you have to be careful. You have to balance both sides of it. But we can't be in a situation where the United States is just a country of assemblers, right? So we have to actually have manufacturing from the very beginning all the way through. One of the things we like to stress is that if you look at this country, about half the workers in the workforce don't have a college education. These people need manufacturing jobs, and the jobs that are spun off, the service jobs that are spun off of manufacturing. So tariffs are not the answer to everything, but they're an important part of it. And we can talk about tariff policy further if you'd like, and the rationale for it.
Well, it seems I think we only have time sort of for one more question. So I think we should end on China being the most important issue. If you had to lay out what you think are sort of the top 2 or 3 priorities for a second stage Chinese agreement, what would they be? What would the goals be?
So first of all, let me take a step back and talk about China policy generally. There are a lot of lanes in China policy, and I'm going to talk about the trade lane. But I'm not going to suggest that if you were sitting here as the president, you would necessarily think the trade lane is the most important part, right? Clearly, the geopolitical lane, the strategic lane, the military, the protection of cyber theft, and the like are crucial. And those are very important things. And there's a lot of stuff going on in China that's not helpful, right? That is moving in the wrong direction. So things like what's going on in India and the South China Sea, and the buildup of their military. There's a lot of things that are going on that are not very helpful. So I think it's always important to realize this is an extremely, extremely complicated relationship, that China has a goal of being #1 in the world, and we have a goal of staying #1 in the world, and that overshadows all the rest of it. Now, within my own lane, within the trade lane, the economic lane, which as I say, in my opinion, is not the most important, but it is important because they have about a $13 trillion economy. This is all pre-COVID, of course, and ours is maybe 22 trillion. So we're a fair amount bigger. But if you look at who's under them, they're at 13. The next one may be Japan at 5 or 6. So they're a huge economy, and figuring out how to have rules that work for us, and they haven't in the last decades, but the rules that work for us is really an important thing to do. So one, we have to make sure that the current agreement, phase 1, is implemented properly, and we're doing that. I think there's a good faith effort on both sides to do that. And those are very important things, all containing the pieces that I outlined. I would say, if you said what else needs to be done, one would be they have an industrial policy, industrial subsidies and the like that are massive. We have to make sure we still protect our intellectual property. That's contained in phase 1, but it's something that you're going to have to continuously be ever vigilant about. Rules to deal with state-owned enterprises, which don't operate for the most part on the same economic rules as ours does. I would say investment rules, right? We have to have very clear rules on investment. You can't be in a position where you have a market economy and a multi-trillion-dollar country state-run economy can come in and change the economics, and you lose intellectual property, you lose data, which is really important. So I would say those are the principal things that someone would talk about in terms of what we would look for in phase two. They're big issues. They're difficult issues. And the other point I'd like to make is that this is not something that's going to be resolved in a short period of time. Between the United States and China, there's a competition for what kind of economy the globe's going to have. And they have a model, and we have a model, and it's essential for our good and the good, I would suggest, of the world that the United States model be the one that prevails. So this is going to be complicated. It's going to be we're going to be steadfast. It's going to go on for a long period of time. It's not going to be a short-term thing. But I think for the first time, really, in our history, we have, at least modern history, we have turned this around, and we're heading in the right direction now. And they understand that we have to have rules that are appropriate for both of us. It's not just a one-way street, and certainly the president understands that.
Mr. Ambassador, respecting your time, we're going to have to leave it there. We hope you'll come back with us another time. We can continue with some other questions from our audience. Thank you for being with us today and for your work on behalf of our country.
Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's great to be with you all.